Very warm welcome to my YouTube channel Guftugu with Haseeb. This is Muhammad Haseeb Khan. Today I'm going to discuss the concept of glycolysis with you all. As we know, the glycolysis is the first step in the metabolism of the glucose, right? So whatever sugar generally we take in, that is basically converted into glucose. That glucose is absorbed into our intestine, then transported to different cells that require the glucose in order to perform the normal body function and in order to generate the energy, right? So the glycolysis is the principal energy generating reaction or the pathway in the living cells or the living organism, right? As the name itself suggests, glycolysis simply the breakdown of glucose right? So the glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, right? Not inside the mitochondria. And all the enzymes of the glycolysis are present inside the cytosol. So glycolysis occurs in the cytosol, it occurs in the absence of oxygen. So that the breakdown of the glucose through the enzyme catalyzed reaction in our cells, in the bacteria and other living organism does not require the oxygen. So the glycolysis is independent of oxygen. Glycolysis occurs inside the cytosol of the cell, not in the mitochondria. The enzyme of the glycolysis are present inside the cytosol, and all these enzymes are constitutive enzymes. That is, these enzymes are always present inside the cell, whether the glucose is present or not, right? So the glycolysis is basically the breakdown of the glucose inside the cell and principally inside the cytoplasm. So the process of glycolysis can be roughly divided into two broad phases or two broad categories. Two broad phases, two broad categories. One is investment phase. Investment phase, and the other is payoff phase. In the investment phase, the process requires the input of 2 ATP molecules per mole of glucose, right? So when one glucose molecule undergoes glycolysis, 2 ATP molecules are consumed in first 5 set of reaction, that is within first 5 set of reactions. So all those first 5 reactions I am referring here as the investment phase, where 2 ATP molecules per mole of glucose are consumed, right? So 2 ATP molecules are consumed. 2 ATP per mole of glucose is consumed, right? And what exactly happens in the investment phase or the first half of the glycolysis? The glucose gets converted into glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, dehyde 3P, that is 2 molecules. So one glucose molecule having 6 carbon atoms is converted into 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. 2 molecules, I am saying 2. So 2 molecules of glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate having 3 carbon each and a phosphate. So where does this phosphate comes from, right? So when we start with the glucose, there is no phosphate. So in the step number 1, there is entry of glucose ATP. that ATP is phosphate donor over there. So the ATP, the phosphate from the ATP is transferred to the glucose, and glucose gets converted into glucose 6 phosphate. Then there is an isomerization reaction that converts the glucose into glucose 6 phosphate into fructose 6 phosphate, right? So in the third step, the fructose 6 phosphate gets converted into fructose 1,3 bisphosphate. So there are two different phosphates, one at the first position and another at the second position of the fructose, right? So here the second phosphate comes from the second ATP molecule that is consumed in the step number 3. So that is why in this investment phase of the glycolysis, 2 ATP molecules are consumed and one glucose molecule gets converted into 2 glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate molecules. This is the summary of the first 5 reactions of the glycolysis. What happens in the next 5 reaction is, in the payoff phase, your the 2 ATP molecules are generated in step number 7 and 10 each, right? So 2 ATP molecules are generated in step number 7, 2 ATP molecules are generated into step number 10, that is the last step of the glycolysis. So the step number 7 is known as the step that undergoes substrate level phosphorylation in order to yield 2 ATP molecules from ADP. So 2 ADP molecules get converted into 2 ATP molecules in step number 7 of the reaction, and similarly the same happens in the step number 10 of the reaction, where we again get 2 ATP molecules, right? And what happens next is the glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate molecules. The glyceraldehyde 3P. I'm encircling the P, that means here that is the representative of the phosphate, right? P and encircle, so it is a symbolic representation of the phosphate, right? So glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate molecules from step number 5 through various other steps get finally converted into pyruvates, right? How many pyruvate molecules? 2 pyruvate molecules, right? One thing that we can notice here, when we started from the glucose without any ATP, right? And we ended up at pyruvate, right? Glucose is having no phosphate, so the pyruvate is also having no phosphate, but glucose is having 6 carbons, pyruvate is having 3 carbons, so we are having 2 pyruvate molecules, so 2 into 3, that is total 6 carbons are conserved. So there is no loss of carbon atom throughout the process, there is no removal of carbon dioxide during the process of glycolysis, and indeed there is consumption of ATP in the step number 1 and step number 3. 1 ATP molecule each is being consumed in the step number 1 and step number 3, and 2 ATP molecules each are being generated through substrate level phosphorylation in step number 7 and 10, right? So the glycolysis is a sequence of 10 enzyme catalyzed reactions that occur in the cytosol of the cell and convert the glucose into pyruvate, ATP and some water molecules, as well as there is generation of NADH, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, in its reduced form that will further serve to yield the energy via oxidative phosphorylation and electron transport chain, right? So I am finishing this particular introductory portion over here with general introduction of the 2 broad categories. One is the investment phase and another is the payoff phase. In the next lecture, we will see how these enzyme catalyzed reactions are exactly look like, and how your glucose molecule gets finally converted into pyruvate molecules with the release of ATP and as well as release of H2 at certain steps, as well as generation of NADH, right? Thank you. Do subscribe, like and share. This is first time I'm asking. Thank you so much.